You're listening to The Back 40, the podcast for Ontario farmers, covering topics and issues that matter most to Ontario agriculture. Brought to you by Trillium Mutual Insurance, bringing the ag community together one podcast at a time. I'm the host of The Back 40, Mike Bryan, agribusiness specialist at Trillium Mutual Insurance. Ever since I can remember, one of the major concerns in the agricultural industry has been that there has not been enough young farmers that are able to get involved. And certainly we've known over the past few years that median age of the farmers in Canada is sneaking up. The last I heard, it was in around 58 was the median for farmers. So when you hear about some farmers that are younger that are able to get into the industry, that's always a good thing. Recently, the Canadian government put in place the Canadian Agricultural Youth Council, which is made up of young farmers across Canada. Today, we're speaking with Jerry Bos from New Brunswick. He's a dairy farmer there, and he is the co-chair of the Canadian Agricultural Youth Council. Jerry, welcome to the Back 40.
Morning. Pleasure to be here.
Can you give us a little bit of a background on the Canadian Agricultural Youth Council and a little bit of information on who it's made up of?
So Youth Council was created roughly 9 months ago, I believe, and applications were open to anyone that is a primary producer or involved in agriculture and agri-food, as well as people that are interested outside of the sector. We actually have some council members that are not involved in agriculture currently. Council makeup spans all across all the sectors. We have representation from the dairy sector, chickens, eggs, beef, crop inputs, and then also hogs are involved as well. Additionally, we have participation from further processing or from other parts of the agri-food sector. We have people involved in potato production, also in processing and storage. And then we have some people that are involved in agriculture from an educational standpoint.
So what is the purpose of the council? Who do they advise, and what is the purpose that they were put in place to fulfill?
We have a mandate to advise both AAFC and the Minister of Agriculture. And basically, we are to advise from the perspective of youth involved or interested in agriculture. On top of that, we've taken it upon ourselves to look at areas of focus or interest to the council to try and see if we can have a positive impact or an effect on our sector, that we could get out there outside of AAFC and in the minister's office and hopefully create some positive spin-off from the actual council itself.
So your journey to farming, you're a dairy farmer in New Brunswick. Your path is a little bit different in that your farm is multi-generational, and we all seem to know what that trail is, but that's not exactly how you came to end up dairy farming, is it?
Originally, my grandfather immigrated from Holland, from the Netherlands, and he lived in Canada for 10 years before he was actually able to purchase a farm. He worked both as a milk tester for other farms, but also he actually worked on several different farms in the area, living in Woodstock, New Brunswick, but then finally moving down to Salisbury and settling here. And at the time, the farm that we purchased didn't have a very large land base. He looked at it and said, what can I grow? What can I produce here to survive? And he was very much, I have to grow my own food. So they had a very large vegetable garden, produced their own food that way to supply themselves. And then they also grew hogs. It was a mixed batch. We had a couple milk cows. There were some hogs and chickens. As farming kind of evolved and we kind of grew a little bit, focused in more heavily on conventional hog production. And my uncle, due to allergies, he was unable to continue farming. And at the time, my father was working at a beef farm and basically came home, took over the farm, and evolved it into a mixed operation of hogs and beef, up to, I think he was shipping about 500 head of cattle a year. And at its peak hog production, I think we were roughly producing, I want to say, about 3,000 hogs a year for market. Unfortunately, he got hit with two very hard market crashes, the first being BSE in 2001. And then the second was the closure of our local hog plant. That kind of forced him to transport his hogs all the way up to Ontario. That added a huge burden on the transportation cost side. And at that time, we were looking at it and evaluating, and I was still quite young. I wasn't prepared to jump into farming. I wasn't ready to do that. I had an interest in becoming a school teacher. But following my first year of university, I kind of switched degrees, went to the Nova Scotia Agricultural College, Dalhousie, and went into agricultural business. By that time, the farm was pretty well shuttered. We still had a small beef herd, cow calf operation. Once I completed my degree, we made the decision that we were going to get back into agriculture. So we applied for the new entrant program in New Brunswick, but then ended up just directly buying quota from another producer that was retiring, and renovated the hog facilities and turned the farm into a dairy farm. We started out milking about 45 cows, and today we're up at 90 cattle and continually planning on growing, innovating, and just continuing to go forward into the future of agriculture.
So how many acres would you be farming now?
Today we're farming, I want to say, roughly 270 acres. Some of that leased, some of it our own. We farm mostly grass silage and corn silage. We're hoping to eventually expand into some further crop inputs.
That's a bit of a different story. Most times when we think of someone in the dairy industry, we think of, well, that's gone from parents into the next generation there, where yours is being a little different there. You started that up when you got out of school there. And how long have you been running that now?
We started milking cows July 28th, 8 years ago. At that time, it was myself full-time on the farm. My father was off farm. Him and his brothers owned a hardware store at the time. And I believe it was, well, just over 3 years ago now that we completed a fairly major renovation. We installed some robotic milkers and extended our barn. And he was able to rejoin me full-time on the farm. So now it's myself and him full-time. That's, I think, a huge achievement or accomplishment on our end, because it's in line with what our family really, really wants to be doing, which is farming as a family and continuing to grow.
Not only are you a young farmer, but different pathway to get to where you are with the dairy operation. What drew you to end up with the Canadian Agricultural Youth Council?
The first person that brought the Youth Council to my attention was my younger sister, Melanie. At the time, she was working on Prince Edward Island as a climate change coordinator, and she caught wind of it and brought it to my attention and said that she thought I'd be a really good fit for the council, just given our unique family history, our perspective, and some of my passion that I have for the industry.
You put an application in and ended up on the council there. How have you found that experience to be?
Overwhelmingly positive. I've enjoyed my time there. I think the rest of the council has as well. It's been very enlightening, because while you think you have a good understanding of the sector, once you get opened up to different perspectives, different insights, and you get to see the information that is brought forward at council meetings, all of a sudden you're opened up the wider range of the industry, of the sector, and you see some of the issues that maybe you would have only seen it from one side. Now you can put yourself in someone else's shoes and say, oh, okay, this makes sense to me now.
So how does the council function then? When do you get together, and what sort of topics do you discuss?
So at the beginning, every 2 months we have a council meeting, and it involves the full council, the minister, some AFC support as well. And AFC has been kind enough to invite guests in, organize the meetings so far, and basically they will bring forward a group or a representative of a group in agriculture to discuss topics of importance to both the council, AFC, and the minister. One of our first meetings involved the leader of the AFEST table, which is the agri-food economic strategy table. And that was Murad Al-Khatib. He's the chair of it. And basically he brought forward what AFEST had been working on for the last several years. And he brought forward, okay, these are the important things that we see. And this table involves some fairly large players, such as CEOs or executives of fairly large agribusinesses, as well as producers of note throughout the country in different sectors. And they made recommendations on how they would like to see the growth of agri-economies in Canada. And he brought forward the recommendations and basically roundtabled them with us. And we were able to discuss, look at things, and give a report back to him following the meeting on what our thoughts are as youth in agriculture on what the work they had been doing. All of our meetings have been fairly impressive in the sense that we've talked with other stakeholders. We had a recent one with FCC where they talked about succession planning and trying to develop programs for new entrants, as an example. Further to that, there was a presentation on how can we look at perception of agriculture in Canada, measuring it, but also how do we rebuild some of that trust within the consumer body.
So you mentioned that you meet with the whole council and have gone through some of this stuff. That sounds like you may also have some smaller groups that meet as well. What sort of topics do they deal with?
We just completed a strategic consultation where we tried to define, okay, what are the key areas of focus that our council cares about the most? And it's not to say that the other topics that are not our main three are not important to us. It's just that how can we as a group or as teams work on something and at the end of our mandate have something to show? The three key areas that we're focusing on are perception and education in agriculture, careers in agriculture is our second topic, and then also agriculture and climate change. And when I look at the perception agriculture or the education in agriculture, we've identified, okay, we have a huge base of resources. We have a lot of knowledge in agriculture, but it's not being translated to consumers. It's not being pushed through school curriculums or anything of the sort. And how can we as a youth council have an effect on that? How can we hope to improve that? How can we have an impact and maybe build some momentum in that area? I look at some of your other guests. You've got Farm and Food Care was your first episode, and then you've got Andrew Campbell, the Fresh Air Farmer. And those groups are doing great work. They're helping to educate the public and they're building awareness. How can we build that into our education system in a positive way? I look at my biology education in high school. I took a biology class or two, and they teach you about some of the life cycles that are very built in and intrinsic in agriculture, but they don't create that linkage. And I think that's a real shame, and that needs to be done. You look in elementary school or middle school, you say there's potential for, everyone's done that little project where you grow a bean sprout in a little styrofoam cup. Let's take it to the next level. Let's build upon that and say, okay, what can you do with that bean sprout? It's great to see the little green leaves, but what can be used, or how do you leverage that knowledge and make it understandable and relatable for consumers, for the general population that are not involved in agriculture?
We've come quite a distance away from the agriculture community. 1% of us as farmers, and not very many of us actually that are directly involved in the growing of crops and the livestock husbandry. And I know when I went to school, we covered things like breeds of cattle and the different breeds of hogs and quite a bit about the agricultural system. A lot of that's been lost because there is no knowledge from the teachers. They don't have that direct knowledge because they don't have that direct connection through. Did you come up, or have you come up with something that you look at and say, hey, this is what needs to happen in order to make that connection that you talked about there?
Kind of, yes. I think the first step is awareness. And the second step is trying to see what is working, what isn't working. If we look at education is mandated provincially, so we don't have a federal education strategy so much as it's a roundtable or a council of ministers of education that sit down and trying to evaluate what's working here, what's working there, where is education doing well, where is it doing poorly. And hopefully we can sit down with that group, or we can leverage our position on the council to influence and prioritize agricultural education. And the way to do that, I think, is to bring together all the different groups that are focused on ag education and sit them down at a round table to discuss this issue and say, okay, we have a lot of very strong voices. We have a lot of clout in the ag sector as far as ag education goes. How can we push that into the education system in a way that is not necessarily branded or commoditized, but is open source or is unbiased in its need to educate the public on where their food is coming from? There's definite benefit to doing that, not just on the education of agriculture side, but 1 in 8 Canadians is involved in the agri-food sector, whether they know it or not, whether they're serving tables or they're a chef or they're involved in processing food or something of that sort. So it's a very important part of our economy.
Yeah, and finding that information is difficult sometimes for teachers to come up with really accurate and really good information there. And I know that there's some groups that are doing some really good work on that. It's time that it was pushed more into our mainstream curriculum.
The resources are there. The knowledge is there. Like, farmers are innovative. Everyone seems to be very well informed in the ag sector. It's more a matter of getting that information out to the other 99%. And maybe that's a failing of our current system.
Do you like what you're hearing from the Back 40? We'd like to hear from you. Send us an email with your comments and thoughts to theback40@trilliummutual.com or follow us on social media @Trillium Mutual. Now, you mentioned you had a couple other topics there, one of which being climate change. What's your focus on for that?
If you look at the spectrum of climate change and its involvement in agriculture today, in some senses, I think agriculture is being scapegoated a little bit for issues in climate change. There's not a lot of consensus or understanding of, okay, what are the impacts that agriculture have on climate? Yes, there is the sensationalized or the overblown idea that agriculture or conventional agriculture is bad for the environment. The first thing we need to do is come up with a policy statement or something that defines where we think we stand today, because in the past, and possibly this is where the consumer base or where everyone is sitting, is they only look at the negative effect that agriculture has. Let's talk about the positive side of things. So if we are emitting carbon, how much are we actually emitting? But on top of that, how much are we sequestering already? How much are we saving rather than just being an emitter? When you start a car, there's an emission attached to it. Same with a cow, same with a chicken or a pig. There's an emission attached to it. But what are the positive effects? For a car, it's very simple. You get to go from point A to point B, either for your job or pick up groceries. But if you're farming, you need to be able to measure both the positives and the negatives efficiently and effectively. And we're not doing that as well as we could. It's getting better for sure. We're on the right track. But we need to transfer that information back to the consumer as well.
Everybody looks at the inputs that you have to put in, the fuel that you have to use in order to grow your crops, and the emissions from, as you say, from the animals themselves. But they lose the idea that when you're growing crops, you're capturing carbon at that point.
There's been a number of different studies that come out that are referenced, and it tries to measure in a percentage what the agricultural emissions are compared to the output of car emissions, as an example of transportation emissions. One such study as an example, and that's the problem with how things are measured, I guess you could say. You have to make sure that you include the entire life cycle of what you're measuring. So when you consider the emissions from a car, don't just measure the tailpipe emissions, measure the construction of the vehicle, the mining that it takes to get the materials. On top of that, you need the processing and refinement of the oil, of everything else that goes into being able to start that car and get from point A and point B. Whereas in agriculture, we already take into account all those measurements, but we don't take into account what are the positive side effects, grassland that sequesters carbon, even corn as a crop. Even if it's done under conventional tillage, there is a positive value associated with that corn crop, which sequesters carbon. We need to do a better job of clearing up some of those misconceptions, enabling us to tell our story.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to tell the story if we did a better job of measuring what it was that we're actually doing from the collection of the carbon. There's lots of people who are willing to tell us what we're doing as far as the emissions of it, but that collection of it is really important. It's one of the few industries out there that the business is actually, when you think about it, you're collecting carbon because that's what all your crops do.
For sure. And I mean, I think you also have to take into account some of the measurements related to our actual food production. You need to look at it and say, okay, if we didn't produce this good or this crop, what is the alternative? What is the alternative production that you would have to do? And how much does that cost on the emission side? And even if it is lower or higher, at least you have that correct measurement so that you can now say, okay, producing one steak versus one, whatever it is, these are the costs associated with both. And now you can look at what the offsets are.
Right. And you can look at, if you've measured it, you can also look at how do you improve that system as well.
Precision in your measurement is important, because if you look at the North American beef production cycle, we are the most efficient as far as producing a pound of red meat goes. And if you're going to use the global average, it's going to weigh us down quite heavily. But if you look at some of our farms that are here today, they're very efficient and they're getting a bad rap for it. And that doesn't make any sense.
No, it's all about telling our story again, back to that education piece that you were talking about previously. Now, you mentioned you've got quite a wide variety of people that sit on the council there. It's not just primary producers, there's a lot of other people. And that leads kind of into your third topic that you are wanting to focus on, and that's careers in agriculture. It's been well documented that people will tell you there's 2, 3, 4 jobs for every grad that we get out of our schools. What's the council's take on that?
I think and all three of our topics are very intertwined. You look at the climate change debate or discussion, how many jobs are being created, how many careers are being created just in that alone. You look at if there's going to be carbon sequestration technology and innovation, that is a career. Then you look at, okay, all through the processing sector in agriculture, there's tons of jobs. And they're not just, when you think of agriculture, when the regular everyday Canadian thinks of agriculture and they hear, let's be a farmer or let's work in agriculture, they're most likely going to look and say, I don't want to be the guy wearing a plaid shirt with overalls and a pitchfork. That is not the existence of agriculture today. For the most part, we're dealing with technology. We're using precision technology, and it's completely different than it was 50 years ago. There's no doubt about that. It's one of the most innovative sectors in the world. Like you just said, there's 4 jobs available for every graduate that moves into the ag sector. We need to fill those positions. Otherwise, we're going to have a huge issue in 10 years because, like you said, 58 is the average age of farmers. And that can carry through the rest of the supply chain as well. So bringing and enticing new entrants and people into the ag sector is more important than ever. And the way to do that, again, is through education. And if you can build that interest young or early and make people more aware of the careers in agriculture, you're going to have more success drawing them into the field. When I went to high school, I went in the office where they basically say, here's some advice for where you should go to school. There was a giant wall full of different universities' booklets, and there was very little mention of agriculture in that. And I'm in a farming community. And that's nothing at fault with my school or with my counselor at all. It's just that throughout Canada, that's the same story. It's just not made apparent that agriculture is a career choice of the 21st century.
And you would think that would have gotten better over the years, but it hasn't. And I can speak to when I was in high school. We had, I think there was 3 of us ended up at Guelph, and only one that ended up in agriculture. That was me. We had one that went through for vets, and then everybody else went out into other different topics. If you suggested that you wanted to come back and farm, that was something that was almost discouraged. It was, there's so many other opportunities out there. And if we've had a generation of doing that, I'm right on the median age for farmers, and people of my age category there are starting to retire out of the professional portion there. We really do need people to replace my generation as we're going forward. And it'd be much better if it was people that are your age or younger, because then you've got that full career and you've got that different perspective that sometimes we lack in my age group, that we don't think along those lines, the same lines as someone your age does.
I really see agriculture as a bit of like a diamond in the rough, or like a hidden gem as it goes towards careers, specifically because it's not talked about right now, but it should be. And if we can build that interest, I think you'll see a large amount of the population want to move into the sector, just because there's a lot of values that are instilled throughout the entire system that are very appealing to people, especially today, given COVID and the changes in our lives. Like, we identified, these are the jobs that are important. These are the jobs that are necessary for our survival as a society. How can you get them interested in that? That comes full circle again, education. But on top of that, you need to make it interesting for them, not just educate them about it, but make them interested in it. And how do you do that? Well, you show them how technological, how advanced our sector has become, and show them where those opportunities may lie, where you can fit within that supply chain and find some value and also find some meaning. I think there's a lot of meaning that can be derived from being part of the supply chain that feeds the world. Farmers are very proud of what they do. And I think other people in the agricultural and agri-food sector are also very proud of what they do because it's genuine. You wake up in the morning and you feel good about what you're doing because you know that you're having a positive impact on the world.
I would agree with that. And this is from a guy who started out farming and sold feed and worked for the government and now works for an insurance company. And it's quite a trip through there. But everything that I've done is related to that agriculture. And as you say, that pride of getting up in the morning and knowing that you're part of a system that has been successful at increasing the amount of food we produce over the last 35, 40, 50 years. There's a lot of satisfaction in that. You're right. We need to inspire some people to get involved in that. And it's not just, as you say, the plaid shirt and overalls and pitchfork. That's a very romantic view of a farmer. But there's a lot of technology in our system now. And I never met a farmer, I don't think, that wasn't keen on what that next piece of technology was going to be that they could implement on their farm.
And I mean, not to bash on the pitchfork, I pick it up every single morning to push feed into the calves. But then I go from doing that to jumping in a tractor and turning on my GPS to look at how I can seed my grass. It's from one end of the spectrum to the other. Like if you are focused in, you just want to do manual labor, great, we can find a place for you. But if you want to be on the top end of the technological scale or even involved in, like you said, like insurance or investment or education, if you want to follow that field all the way through, there's positions all throughout the sector that are much more diverse than the pitchfork would lead you to believe.
Absolutely. So you talked about your mandate as a council there. How long are you going to be on this, and what do you hope to accomplish by the time you're done? If you could say when you get done with your mandate, what is it that you want to say, this is what we accomplished?
So the mandate is for 18 months, but they've kind of pushed it a little bit just because we had roughly 2 months just to get the whole council started because we are the first council. June 31st next year, I believe, is the end of our mandate, at which point about half the council will take a step back and they will leave the council, and the other half has the potential to stay on board. The only rules are that you have to be under 30 by the time the next iteration of the council begins. And basically, this ensures a little bit of continuity at the council, but also brings in some new voices. So there's 25 of us. Half of us will step down, and the other half hopefully will continue that work, and then they'll bring on a new cohort associated with it. And that way you can kind of have continuity all throughout the next 10 years, roughly, or however long. And after this year is done, I'm hoping that if we can have a small impact, that's perfect. That's great. We're supposed to advise from a youth perspective, and that's kind of sets the tone for the next 20, 30 years, and it's ongoing. But we can't be arrogant about it or ignorant to the fact that this sector is way bigger than the 25 of us. If we can just play a small part in helping out in our own way, either through helping to positively influence ag education as an example, or set the tone for what we believe climate change in agriculture really is, then I'll look at us as being successful. I'm hoping that through different initiatives that we've taken on, that we can really start creating some momentum. If we can have a breakthrough this year on at least getting the right people in one room to talk about how we can improve ag education, that's a big win for me. And I think it's a big win for the council as a whole. As far as ag careers go, if we can identify where we're seeing successes in bringing new entrants into agriculture or bringing people into careers in agriculture, and possibly share that information with AFC or with other groups out there, then all of a sudden you've had a positive impact. If I look at, there's agricultural companies out there that have need for new employees, but they have no way of sourcing it because they can't get people interested. But if we were able to review and look at other companies or other organizations that are doing a good job at ag mentorship, as an example, possibly that information can get funneled through to that group or that organization, and they can build off of it. They can build momentum just by seeing what is working elsewhere and how can they leverage that knowledge. And then as it relates to climate change, I think more than anything, because it's such a long-term issue, making a statement that says, hey, this is what we believe about agriculture and its impact on climate change will be a pretty iconic thing to do.
It seems a little bit strange to say by the time the next council rolls around, you're going to be actually too old for it. And you're only in your early 30s, which I have a lot of more experience with getting too old to do things. My guess is, though, that your greatest legacy is going to be the foundation that you've built for future councils going forward and for the work that they're going to be able to do to build on what the initial council has accomplished here.
The objective that I've had since becoming co-chair, basically to legitimize or basically establish the council as a body that can be looked at as a source of information or a resource for AAFC to bounce ideas off or build momentum with, and then also for the minister to come down and sit down with and have an honest conversation with about some of the issues that she or the next minister sees as an issue. And hopefully we can provide some perspective from our end that might help with policy decisions. If you look at a minister's job is to take on a fairly large burden. You're at the end of the line when it comes to decision making, and you want as much advice as possible, and you want good, honest advice. You want to be able to sit there and say, okay, let's have a conversation in a closed room or over the phone or whatever, and say, what do you think about this specific topic? And understanding that we are a youth council and our perspective is one of people under the age of 30, that has a big impact, because that's talking about, okay, this is where we're at today and this is where we think we're going to be in 30 years.
It's really important to have that influence and the ability to be able to influence what that policy will be in the short term, medium term, and long term, I think is going to be huge. And since you are the future of agriculture, it's a good thing that somebody's going to listen to what your opinion is, and you get the chance to help shape what that future is going to look like. I want to take an opportunity to thank you for joining us on the Back 40. Thanks very much. It's been very interesting. We'll have to check in again with you when you're nearer to the end of your mandate and see what your impressions of the experience has been at that point.
My pleasure, Mike, and I really enjoyed the show, and it's been great talking to you this morning.
Join us next time when our guest will be Dr. Andrew Davidson from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and we'll be talking about how satellites help agriculture in Canada. You've been listening to The Back 40, brought to you by Trillium Mutual Insurance. Be sure to subscribe to The Back 40 wherever you find your favorite podcasts so that you don't miss an episode. The Back 40, bringing the ag community together one podcast at a time. I'm Mike Brine. Until next time, take care and stay safe.